Good afternoon and welcome to the Philippine Geographical Society Lecture Series 2022. This is the fifth lecture series that we are conducting for this year. So this is brought to you by the Philippine Geographical Society in partnership with the UP Department of Geography. My name is Kathy Illustre and I will be the moderator for this event. Before we proceed, please allow me to tell you about the house rules for this session. During the presentation, please put your microphones on mute, but we encourage you to interact with the online community attending this session by typing your comments and questions in the chat box or through our social media accounts in Twitter and Facebook. Questions will be addressed during the open forum. This lecture is being simultaneously streamed in the UP Department of Geography YouTube channel. Also, please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be made available for viewing after the event. And just to give you a heads up, we will be taking a group photo before we end the session. So please be ready to turn on your video camera for that activity. To give the opening remarks, I would like to call Professor Eman Garcia, President of the Philippine Geographical Society.
Thank you, Ma'am Cathy. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. On behalf of the Philippine Geographical Society and the UP Department of Geography, I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who have joined us in this lecture. The PGS Lecture Series is a monthly gathering where we feature a specific geographical undertaking in the Philippines. And this is the fifth lecture this year, but the 20th lecture overall since we started last year. The PGS LS is co-sponsored by the UP Department of Geography. Our theme for this session's lecture is Vulnerability and Resilience and is to be delivered by an alumnus of the Department of Geography. I am also extra happy to hear his lecture because he also once was the president of the Junior Philippine Geographical Society, the junior members of or undergraduate members of the Philippine Geographical Society. We also started this tradition in the PGS LS where we develop a word cloud from your registration keywords. For this lecture, the dominant word is Filipinos, together with words such as adaptability, bamboo, social, masses, smart, strong, urgent, influential, and traits. Other interesting words include anti-fragile, readiness, risks, setbacks, traits, and my personal favorite, me. May naglagay ng me. Maybe we can ask our speaker later to correlate this word cloud to the lecture that he is giving. Thank you once again for joining us this afternoon on behalf of the PGS and the UP Department of Geography. Welcome to the 5th PGS LS for 2022.
Thank you, Professor Garcia. As was hinted earlier, the PGS has been conducting a number of these lecture series for more than a year now. And as we continue to move toward our goal of presenting applied geography undertakings in the Philippines, it is with such pride that we have an alumnus of the UP Department of Geography to give a presentation on measuring vulnerability and resilience. Our presenter this afternoon is a climate and disaster risk and reliance specialist and advocate. He is working in Arup, where he manages a regional technical assistance project on resilience measurement, communication, and capability building under the ADB Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. He holds a Master of Environmental Management and Development degree from the Australian National University and Bachelor of Science in Geography from UP Diliman. And as was mentioned earlier by Professor Garcia, he was also the president of the Junior Philippine Geographical Society. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Luigi Toda. You can use your reactions in Zoom to show our welcome to our speaker, Mr. Toda.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm not sure if the video, I think I have a problem activating my video, but let me just share my screen first. Thank you, Miss Kathy, for the warm introduction. give me a few seconds to just upload my, share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
There, yes.
Yep.
You just need to put on the presenter mode.
All right. Yeah. Just quickly. Sorry, my laptop seems acting up.
We've all been there on a live presentation. Yes, we'll wait. No worries.
Yeah. So yeah, before we proceed with the next slides, so basically, I work with Arup for a couple of years now. So basically, we're working on a project with the Asian Development Bank under the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. So later on, I'll be delving into the details of that project, especially the measuring resilience part, where we conducted city resilience index in different cities across different countries. So let me just try if, can you see the presenter mode now? No, not yet.
No, still the slide deck.
Let me just fix this. Sorry. There you go.
There you go. Yes.
All right. Okay. So yeah, thanks again, Miss Kathy, for the introduction. Just wanted to check again if my audio is clear from your side.
Loud and clear, Iggy.
Thanks. Great. Thanks. So allow me to take this opportunity to thank the Philippine Geographical Society and the UP Department of Geography for inviting me to share my insights. So both insights and at the same time, my experience on measuring vulnerability and resilience. So these are two topics that are kind of hot now in terms of in the context of climate change and disasters. But I hope that by the end of the session, you'll be able to pick up something about how we conceptualize, understand, and measure vulnerability and resilience in the context of climate change and disasters. Okay. Yeah, so this photo, no, I'm not that guy in that photo. Not even close to branding my affection off to my wife in a public under the rain, but that can happen. And no, we're not jealous or bitter about these, sweet newlyweds kissing down their marriage amidst a storm or a flood. But look at the kids, no, those innocent little kids. They are exposed to a phenomenon called public display of affection, or in disaster terms, we call it a hazard, if you like. Diba? But on a serious note, disasters have become a way of life for many Filipinos like us. And Filipinos have this inexplicable sense of ability to smile, swim in a chest-deep flood, or brave the storm to marry a girl that you've been dreaming of your whole life in tough situations such as massive disasters like the super typhoon that swept a lot of properties and claimed the lives of over 6,000 Filipinos back in 2013. That was the Typhoon Yolanda. It was even touted as one of the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded in terms of magnitude and intensity in human history. That's, global and worldwide. But how does this photo, take a look of it, this what we call Filipino brand of resilience, speak of the real, entrenched, and enduring social conditions of Filipinos before, during, and after disasters? What is beneath those faces, those smiles, those kisses? Are we trying to glorify resilience? Does romanticizing resilience sidetrack us from addressing larger systemic issues that contribute to our country's vulnerability? So this is where the concepts of vulnerability and resilience come in, which will be the focus of my presentation this afternoon. So let me zoom out a bit to the global level and talk about vulnerability in this scale, okay? So what you see here is a map of climate change vulnerability index globally back in 2013. And now, without going into too much technical details, you can see the redder the color, the more at risk or vulnerable the country or the city is to climate change. And the greener the color, the less vulnerable or more resilient the city is, at least in this map, okay? So at the city level, you can see that Manila, at the eastern side, close to the Pacific Ocean, you can see that Manila has been ranked second most vulnerable to climate change as of 2013. But just imagine how Manila is currently faring today, considering convergence of multiple factors such as income inequality, poverty, unemployment, displacement, and then you combine all of them with exposure to more intensified and more extreme droughts, for example, El Nino, tropical cyclones, typhoons, and many other climate change factors. Now, obviously, we can see that some countries or cities are more vulnerable than others, okay? And unfortunately, Manila or the Philippines more widely is one of the most vulnerable to climate change. And we call this differential vulnerability. As I mentioned, for today's session, I'll be discussing two important topics in the context of climate change and disasters. One is the concept of vulnerability, and the other one is resilience. So first, let's talk about vulnerability and how it is defined and interpreted. So in general sense, vulnerability is the result of a mix of different circumstances. When combined, might result to negative impacts such as distress, risk, and exclusion to a certain population group, okay? In other words, vulnerability is not just about natural hazards. I want to repeat that. Vulnerability is not just about natural hazards or exposure to those hazards, but it is a result or an outcome. Take note of the operative word result of a combination of different factors that you as a person or us as a social or ecological system are presented with. Now, zooming into the context of disaster risk reduction on the second bullet, we defined vulnerability as the characteristics determined by different factors. So it's physical, social, economic, and environmental factors, which increase the susceptibility of different systems. Could be individuals, it could be assets, it could be infrastructure, your family or community to the impacts of natural hazards. Okay? Meaning several factors are shaping how much a system will be impacted by natural hazards. But for clarification, natural hazard does not equate to disaster. Natural hazards and disasters are related, but they're not the same. Okay? A natural hazard is the threat of a natural event that will likely have a negative impact, okay? While disaster is the negative impact following an occurrence of a natural hazard, okay? Meaning when it already happened. In the event that it significantly harms an individual, a community, or a system. Now, moving into the context of climate change. Please bear with me. I just wanted to define all of these concepts for you to be able to understand these better. In the context of climate change, we define it as the propensity or predisposition to be negatively affected and lack of capacity to cope and adapt. Take note of the words capacity, cope, and adapt. I think I've seen all of these words in the word cloud a while ago, presented by Sir Eman. And it really relates to what we define as vulnerability. And it's pretty much the same as the definition above in the second bullet, but it emphasizes coping capacity and adaptation more than reducing vulnerability, okay? When we talk about vulnerability in the social sense, more than the physical sense, it is the unequal distribution of disaster impacts on the population and across geography or space. Okay, we talk about geography and space, which are not determined by natural forces, okay, but by social systems like governance, power relations, and all of these things, political economy. We call this social vulnerability. So as you can see, defining vulnerability is complex and it has multiple definitions. There is no single definition when it comes to vulnerability because there are many different possible interpretations. So it's subjective, so I want you to take a grain of salt when trying to define, understand, and measure vulnerability. So if we put this into a simple arithmetic, very simple arithmetic perspective, these are the components of vulnerability that we need to take into consideration when measuring it. First, exposure to natural hazards. Second, sensitivity. Third, adaptive capacity. When combined, it would be easier for us to understand how vulnerable a community or a system is. So the first photo, image, natural hazard, it is a natural event. We cannot do anything about it because it's natural. Okay, you can mitigate or prevent its impacts, but you cannot control it. And then second, we have exposure. It is the nature or condition that makes a community or household or a system easily affected by the impacts of natural hazards. For instance, how near or far your house is to a river that easily spills over during the rainy or monsoon season. So the closer you are to the river or a natural body of water, the more likely your exposure is high. Okay. And then next would be sensitivity. It is the level to which a community is susceptible to the potential impacts of hazards. Some examples of this is population density, population growth, age, sex, and gender. Okay. And lastly, adaptive capacity. It is basically the ability or potential, take note of the word ability or potential, of a community to successfully adjust or adapt to recover from a disaster. So this is where governance, institutional mechanisms, say land use planning, policies, even financial resources, the use of DRRM funds or access to People's Survival Fund come in. Okay. Now we move on to how I've defined already what vulnerability is in different interpretations from different contexts. Now let's try to see how we assess or measure vulnerability. Okay, so there are different approaches to measuring vulnerability, and measuring it also depends on the scale, type of vulnerability that you're trying to look at. As I mentioned, could be social vulnerability or physical vulnerability, or a combination of both. The availability of data, and of course, your purpose for using the assessment. There are also biases surrounding the conduct of the study. So I'll be showing to you later on what are these biases and how much we can reduce all of these biases eventually. But before designing a vulnerability assessment, answering some questions, there are 3 questions there, basic questions about what you are trying to accomplish more broadly, will help you frame better what is needed for your vulnerability assessment. So the scope, okay, which sectors are relevant? It could be health, infrastructure, water, ecosystems, okay? What is your geographic scope? It could be national, provincial, community, or barangay level. What is your time scale? It could be 5 years, 20 years, 50 years, depending on your development agenda. Okay. And then in the case of most programs, vulnerability assessments are often relevant at the following 3 levels. Okay. First, to inform strategic decisions, such as geographic scope of a country portfolio. For example, what are the most at-risk economic sectors or regions in the country? Okay, that's one. Second, to inform the design of a portfolio or initiative within a sector, like let's say health or transport. For example, what are the climate-related vulnerabilities facing food security? Okay, and lastly, to inform specific investments within a program, such as which assets should be upgraded or which adaptation strategies are viable within a specific community or site. Okay, so this initial step in framing a vulnerability measurement will guide the level of effort required for a certain assessment. Okay. So let me provide you or share with you a study that I conducted back when I was in Australian National University in 2016 for my master's major research essay or thesis. So I found the following vulnerability challenges in the Philippines. So first, around hazard frame, technological solutions, and aid dependence. So it doesn't have any quantitative measurement, but it is mostly qualitative research data gathering. Okay, for the hazard frame, Professor Gillard, I think he taught in the UP Department of Geography too. He said he believes that the dominant perspective in disaster risk management in the country is the hazard paradigm, which has significantly influenced our policies around disaster risk reduction and management. They thought that this is a traditional approach which has maintained a disaster risk reduction and management structure that is top-down, that's first, technocratic, and command and control. We can see this in the administration of National DRRM Council, National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, which is still left with the Office of Civil Defense. Okay? Medyo defense thinking pa rin at response thinking pa rin yung focus niya. It is structured in hierarchy and chains of command, no? Military approach, no? Focusing on response and relief. This runs counter to the new proactive approach of the new paradigm stated in our Republic Act 10121, which is the DRRM Act, enacted 2011. Okay, so it's been 11 years. So how do we assess right now if these mechanisms are still working for the betterment of the country? Then we have technological solutions. Again, the bias towards the hazard frame that I mentioned a while ago has led to a focus on structural mitigation measures such as flood control projects. This high regard to the efficiency of traditional strategies on flood protection creates that false of security, or what we call false sense of resilience, making people more reliant to hard engineering measures. Right now, there are a lot more than physical infrastructure. We have nature-based solutions, community, capital, social capital. We have to strengthen on those things. Okay, in even planning, land use planning. Ultimately, technical solutions often result in passive and reactive behavior towards disasters. And it's very common for us Filipinos, individuals, and even the government in terms of preparing for disasters. Aid dependence. We are very passive and reactive to disasters, and it provokes dependency on external aid, which creates a moral hazard. We are very fixated on the convenience of external aid, like IFIs, financing from development agencies, that it tends to keep undertaking risk-prone development, such as flood control projects that I mentioned a while ago. As such, the Philippines is often using the moral hazard to legitimize focus on hard engineering solutions and response measures more than prevention, mitigation, and preparedness measures, fundamentally to attract more aid, which does less in reducing risk and vulnerability. Another vulnerability challenge that we've seen is the weak local institutional capacity. So one manifestation of this is the lack of capacity of local DRRM offices and staff within LGUs. There also appears to be lack of awareness of concerned local government offices of the law or the policies itself, which presents drawbacks in terms of coordination between national and local government agencies, which we have seen from the past disasters, even back in 2013, in 2017, 18, and even last year. Okay, and also there's also the issue about integrating DRRM into the development agenda, which over the past decades has been very slow and the progress is very, steady towards taking into account disaster risk reduction in national framework for physical planning and medium-term Philippine development plans. Okay. So lastly, social services are focused on addressing short-term needs. No, very focused tayo doon sa, we call it ayuda, for peace, conditional cash transfer, and not addressing the root causes of vulnerability. Okay, now one example at the city level, kanina we discussed the national level. Now at the city level is the use of social vulnerability index. So we conducted this study with my previous organization, OML Center, post Yolanda back in 2014 to 2015, with the aim of providing a better understanding of vulnerability in selected Yolanda-affected cities and to facilitate informed risk reduction decisions at the local level. So we conducted the study, if you can see in the map there on top, in Tacloban and Ormoc in the eastern side of Leyte, and then Palo and Cananga in the western side of the province, using a modified social vulnerability index. We call it SOVI. Okay, we tried to modify this index developed by, I think she is also a geographer, Susan Cotter, an academic and researcher who pioneered the index, using proxy indicators that are relevant to the Philippine context and that are available in terms of data. So we have 35 sub-indicators. I won't delve into the technical details, but the results of the study show that the municipality of Palo, okay, in the eastern side of the Leyte province, obtained the highest overall SOVI, the vulnerability index, basically influenced by very high flood susceptibility, so that's exposure, okay, low level of information and awareness about disasters or disaster preparedness, so that's susceptibility and adaptive capacity, lack of disaster risk reduction activities in terms of preparedness and response, and lastly, high level of livelihoods at risk. For example, farming, fishery, these are the livelihoods that are very vulnerable to changing climate, okay? And an increasing pattern of the vulnerability index and the number of deaths, okay, from western to eastern municipalities was observed, which could be attributed to higher hazard exposure of the eastern municipalities. So aside from the susceptibility and adaptive capacity factors, there's also a factor of exposure in terms of topography and geography. So as you may know, the major focus of the devastation of Typhoon Yolanda was on the east coast of Samar and Leyte. The death toll of the eastern coast was high because there are no hills. Okay? You can see the hills providing protection for the residents of densely populated area from substantial storm surge producing winds. So the presence of any topographical barriers such as mountain ridges reduces the intensity of tropical cyclones in coastal areas located in the leeward side. Leeward side in geography or climatology, shout out to my climatology prof, Ma'am Darlene. This is the drier side, or where the prevailing winds pass after they hit the mountain. So this makes coastal areas in the windward side, the other side of the hill, of a tropical cyclone more exposed to storm surge. So that explains also, in terms of exposure and physical vulnerability, why there are more deaths in the eastern side of the Leyte province. So looking at the hazard susceptibility maps below, the three maps there, the areas located in eastern plains have larger extents of hazard susceptibility. We have, sorry, I cannot zoom it, but we have landslide there, we have storm surge, and we have flooding, okay? In other words, topographic factors contribute to depth and extent of flooding from storm surge. Overall, our study finds that the impacts of Typhoon Yolanda not only highlighted the exposure of several Philippine cities to climate-related hazards, but also magnified the underlying causes or conditions of their vulnerability to climate-related hazards. So this is just one example quickly of, if we use the city level a while ago, we also conducted a barangay level vulnerability assessment, but with different proxy indicators that we use there. But one thing that I would like to emphasize here is that Barangay 88, I think in the lower part of the map, the hardest hit barangay in Tacloban City, with the most number of reported casualties from Typhoon Yolanda, is consistently high or highest in all factors of vulnerability. So that's sensitivity, the one with the purple color, adaptive capacity, and then exposure. If you combine all of them, you have a perfect combination for a disaster. So here are 3 maps showing specific indicators of vulnerability overlaid into a map. I just want to emphasize how maps are very important. We talk about this in geography. The first map shows the percentage of affected population and poverty incidence per province. Okay. Again, this is in the context of Yolanda, the first and second maps. The second map shows the number of casualties and population density per province. Okay. And the third map shows a different typhoon path models, okay, overlaid to provincial density indicator. So we conducted this prior to any disaster with OML Center. But to easily understand the indicators that contribute to vulnerability, maps are useful in informing local government units, NGAs, which is national government agencies, and other decision makers to better prepare for and respond to disasters and make vulnerable communities more resilient in the long term. Speaking of making vulnerable communities resilient, let's now talk about resilience and how it is interpreted differently in different contexts. We all know that climate change is changing, and many countries are on the front lines of managing this reality. Whether typhoons, influx of refugees, or just recently COVID-19, massive crisis seems to be the new normal. But against this backdrop, we're seeing some sort of an emerging paradigm for how we plan our future. Okay? While we're trying to reduce vulnerability, as I mentioned a while ago, we're also seeing the emergence of building resilience. In its general sense, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And in the context of climate change, it is the capacity of social, economic, and ecosystems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance. It's the same thing as disaster resilience, where it means that it is the ability to resist, absorb, adapt to, recover from the impacts of hazard. So generally, we see a trend of the word here: resist, absorb, and even cope, adapt, improve. But I would like to also emphasize that there's this definition made by Oxfam, proposed by Oxfam, that resilience is the ability of women and men to realize their rights and improve their well-being despite shocks, stresses, and uncertainty. Meaning, there's also this gender dimension that we need to consider. And there's also that temporal dimension that we need to consider. Okay. But like vulnerability, it is interpreted loosely, debated heavily, and depicted vaguely. And we often encounter this concept being abused, glorified, and even romanticized, particularly in a political context or environment like the Philippines. So, but what are the issues that come with romanticizing Filipino resilience? Lagi natin binabanggit yung, we are all resilient, matatag tayo and all. But this is dangerous and problematic because it detracts from the suffering that the victims of disasters are experiencing. Secondly, it also undermines the importance of immediate action from different stakeholders like us, and that includes government institutions. It also shifts the accountability to the victims rather than the institutions that are supposed to help the country prepare. They are mandated basically to prepare, respond to, and recover from disasters. But the resiliency in the context of climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction goes beyond this, Filipino brand of resilience. It requires capacity and effective climate and disaster governance. Governance is very important, which is mandated by our national policies. Now, let's shift our focus a bit to resilience of cities, as they are subject to a wide range of natural and man-made pressures that have the potential to cause significant disruption. Today, a city's ability to supporting the well-being of its citizens can be compromised by risks and vulnerabilities from climate change to infrastructure deficit and unplanned, urban growth to pandemics. Okay? But how do we define urban climate change resilience and urban resilience? And what are the actions that help build resilience in the urban systems? First, urban climate change resilience is the capacity of cities to function so that the people living and working in cities, particularly the poor and vulnerable, survive and thrive in the face of shocks and stresses. And then we have urban resilience. No? Let's take a bit, the climate change context out there, which describes a city that is resilient on three main levels. First, the systems of the city survives shocks and stresses. Second, the people and organizations are able to accommodate these stresses into their day-to-day decisions. Third, the city's institutional structures continue to support the capacity of people and organizations to fulfill their dreams or aims or objectives on the ground. So lastly, when asking the necessary actions to help build resilience, at the city level, we should respond to three questions, okay? How does the city work? So that's the urban systems. What are the direct and indirect impacts of climate change? And lastly, who is least able to respond to shocks and stresses? These are the vulnerable groups. But how can we make resilience tangible and practical for cities? How can resilience be applied by cities to build sound strategies and prioritize public investments? Like vulnerability assessments that I mentioned a while ago, there are several tools and approaches to measuring and assessing resilience at different scales. That could be, national, provincial, regional, community, or barangay level. But at the city level, one example of which is the City Resilience Index, which Arup, my current organization, has developed, I think back 2013, which is a new way to understand and champion resilience in cities. Basically, the framework of this is structured along 4 dimensions of resilience, which you can see in the 4 quadrants of the outermost circle in the left image. Okay? These dimensions are first, health and well-being. Second, economy and society. Third, infrastructure and environment. And lastly, leadership and strategy. So underpinning these 4 dimensions are 12 resilience goals. So you can see them in the first column of the second image at the right side of the slide, that each and every city should strive towards in order to achieve resilience. And then it is comprised of 52 indicators. That's quite a lot. In the second column, which are assessed based on responses to 156 questions. Essentially, the idea of this index or framework was to create a practical tool that would help cities understand and measure their resilience, and to allow cities to make better investment decisions and inform urban planning practices that improve resilience of their cities in the long term. On a more practical note, we applied the CRI from the previous slide in the ADB Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. It is a multi-donor trust fund administered by ADB with contributions from different governments. UCT-RTF aims to support fast-growing cities in Asia to reduce the risk of poor and vulnerable people uh, facing, floods, storms, or droughts by helping them to better plan and design infrastructure to invest against these impacts. So Arup, my current organization, is leading a consortium that measures the overall resilience impact of the investments and activities being implemented through this project, this trust fund. As you can see, we developed the what we call the city resilience profile, okay, which summarizes the resilience of a city in 17 cities. You can see from the Philippines, we have La Trinidad, Malay, Haniway, Del Carmen. In Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and a couple of others in Vietnam. And basically, we conducted the baseline study, which uses a combination of primary and secondary data. So we adapted the CRI here, and we applied the index to help LGUs or city governments to prepare ahead of any disaster and to make their cities more resilient amid different shocks and stresses. Okay, some photos during the baseline survey in different cities in 2018. Just in addition, as I mentioned, we have the city level resilience scale, but we also have household resilience. We conducted household surveys per city, which led us to identify the different dimensions that contribute to household resilience, at the same time to city resilience. The same baseline multi-dimensional resilience measurement approach will be executed at the end lining study in the next slide later. But there's another study that we'll be conducting following the baselining. Okay, and then one of the results from the city resilience profiling that we conducted, as you can see here, are the results of the baseline resilience study in one of the cities, which is Bagarat, Bangladesh. It is one of the most vulnerable, cities in Bangladesh, and is prominently flat in terms of terrain and lies 2 meters above sea level, meaning the city is exposed to a variety of climate shocks and stresses, particularly flooding and storm surge. And the city is also threatened by urban flooding, lack of drainage capacity, housing supply, poor urban planning. Okay, but we wanted to test all of these, observations through city surveys and household surveys. So we have the city resilience profile. Okay, for the city survey, the scale is interpreted as 1, which is very poor, to 5, excellent. And Bagarat is faring well in terms of leadership and strategy. That's 3.7. It's quite, good and in the standard of City Resilience Index and economy and society. And they need to improve more in terms of health and well-being and infrastructure and ecosystems. Okay. For the household survey, basically it provides an initial indication of household resilience perception. So this is perceptions based on our household surveys rather than a comprehensive assessment. Okay, 90% of household respondents feel that they had sufficient access to food. So that's good. Okay. And then 70% of the respondents have asset ownership, and 75% say that they have access to basic social services, which is good. However, 53% are still dependent. As I mentioned a while ago, aid dependents, okay, dependent on government safety programs. So that's understandable given that, many households are, below poverty lines. So most likely they would need the support of the government in terms of response and preparedness during disasters. And then 1/4 of citizens believe they become, they turn into a better position after a shock. This is quite surprising. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but that's what the survey says. While half of the citizens remain in the same situation. So this is quite surprising. But we'll be validating this through what we call an end-line study. This will be conducted between June to July 22. Okay. Uh, Basically, we'll be conducting a comparison of two data points from 2018 and then 2022 and identify changes in resilience over time in each city. Okay, and then we have skill and data collection methods, as I mentioned a while ago, for the city and household, and the analysis of which can be attributable to UCCRTF supported interventions. We want to test if, let's say, the interventions provided by ADB, UCCRTF, can be attributable to the changes of resilience. It might be positive or it might be negative. Okay, and then it will provide a snapshot of the change between the baseline exercise conducted in 2018 and the end line results. Okay, and then lastly, before we end the presentation, to sum up, allow me to wrap up my presentation by sharing why measuring vulnerability and resilience is important. Okay, first, increased understanding of vulnerability and addressing the root causes that make people vulnerable to disasters would help reduce the potential impacts of climate-related hazards. This is very important, that we understand vulnerability and address the main causes that shape vulnerability. Second, vulnerability assessments contribute to the development and implementation of resilience of socioeconomic and ecological systems. We're not just talking about, urban systems, economic systems, but also generally socioeconomic and ecological environmental systems. Okay, and then vulnerability and resilience measurements can assist in ranking. As I've shown in the past in one of our studies, we did rank some of the barangays in terms of vulnerability. So that's one thing. And identification of the most vulnerable and most resilient areas and help these areas prioritize adaptation planning and investments. So we have, in the Philippines, we have what we call the local climate change action plans and the local disaster risk reduction and management plans. So if we have this kind of assessments, it will inform better the decision-making processes for LGUs and at the same time other sectors of the local municipality. Fourth is it is useful for identifying potential interventions for increasing adaptive capacity, like capacity to, let's say, provide more resources or provide more technical capacity to DRRM officers to conduct vulnerability assessments or conduct geographic information systems, and reducing vulnerability of a sector in a specific geographic area. And lastly, as I emphasized multiple times, the outcome of vulnerability and resilience measurements can inform the prioritization and implementation of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction decisions, both at the national level, provincial level, and even at the city level. With that, thank you for listening. I'd be happy to answer questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi, for a very informative talk on resilience and vulnerability. So at this point, we will be proceeding with the open forum. We encourage everyone to type in their questions in the Zoom chat box so that we can address them, or you may raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged so that you can directly ask your question to Luigi. Right. So, Luigi, you started your presentation with a picture, which feels, although it's not you, it feels like there's a personal story to these concepts of resilience and vulnerability. And I know that you've been working in the field of climate change and disaster risk assessment. So what I wanted to ask first, since ganyan mo naman din siya sinimulan, is What is your personal interest or reason that you got into this particular field of research, vulnerability and resilience? Meron bang backstory yan na pwede mong ma-share sa amin?
Funny thing, well, it started, well, of course, way back when I was, I think, second year or first year, um, taking up Bachelor of Science in Geography. So it was really Ma'am Darlene, climatology, in physical geography that made me decide that this is something that I would be interested in, and also I think in terms of GIS, Miss Cathy, that's you taught Zog 197. So I wanted to have that kind of mix between uh, the physical aspects and the social aspects of geography. So that's when I started, exploring the importance of geography in terms of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And we also had our field work in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, 2010 or 2009 was about vulnerability assessment as well, supported by GIZ. So that also influenced me to go towards this path. And yeah, I think basically that's it. Mostly because of my background in geography.
Yeah, the things that shape our curiosity, our interest, the influences in our lives, no? Talagang yung mga teachers natin are instrumental for that. So thank you for sharing that, Luigi. Now we go to some of the technical aspects of what you presented. First question that I have here is from TJ Cipriano. How did the organization come up with the vulnerability and resilience indices, and what made it applicable to the different cities in the world? And the follow-up question, what challenges did the organization encounter in coming up with these indices?
Sorry, I missed the first question. Can you repeat that, Ms. Cathy?
Yeah. So how did the organization come up with the vulnerability and resilience indices, and what it made it applicable to various cities in the world?
Okay. Thanks for that question. It's quite complex. Let me begin with the Social Vulnerability Index. So that was with OML Center back in 2013 or 2014. So again, as I mentioned, there is this kind of bias, at least for me and some of our researchers back then. So we had a background on social vulnerability index, and then we tried to apply the index. Usually, this is being used in the Western countries, mostly in the North America and South America, and even in Europe. But then we tried to tweak some of the indicators, provided by Susan Cotter. She's a geographer too. And then we adapted and modified the index to fit the context here in the Philippines, specifically in Leyte and in Eastern Samar. So that's one. For the City Resilience Index, I'm not too familiar with it, but because it was developed back, I think 10 years ago with Arup. I was still not yet with Arup back then, but based from my understanding, they conducted thorough research and piloting of the resilience indicators initially. So they proposed certain resilience indicators first and dimensions, and then they piloted the indicators through focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and I'm not sure if they used household surveys as well to make sure that these dimensions are relevant to the context of different cities across the globe, and at the same time, if they are, temporal in terms of time, they are still relevant. So basically, those are the main factors that shape development of the two indices, both for SOVI and both for the CRI.
So were there any challenges that the organization encounter?
So I can
Either
only
with coming up with these indices or applying the indices for various cities?
Right. Good question. Well, I can only speak of my experience with OML Center. I think one of the main challenges there is, we're trying to apply. I think this is the first SOVI, I'm not sure, that has been applied in a developing country context. So that's one. Um, I we also missed one step that we're supposed to be doing, which is to ask the city officials, the stakeholders, what are the most relevant indicators or indices for them that can be considered in the study. So that's one main challenge, because it was post Yolanda, 3-4 months after, so they're quite busy, focused on addressing the issues in their constituents, for their constituents. So we didn't we're not able to provide that kind of opportunity for them, to provide inputs into the indices. So it's mostly, we call it expert judgment in the identification of indices.
Yeah.
I think that's the main challenge there, Ms. Kathy.
Okay. So I have another question that goes right in there with what you were talking about. So this is from Sir Jake Kadag. Qatar's SOVI is based on socioeconomic data, and vulnerability is really about the presence of vulnerable sectors themselves. So kung maraming matanda, PWD, mahirap na pamilya and others sa isang lugar, syempre mas vulnerable, and we create a risk level like low, medium, and high vulnerability. So the question is, in your experience in the Yolanda affected areas, did it make sense using this type of assessment? Useful nga ba talaga yung mga naging DRRM planning? And according to Sir Jake, feeling niya medyo merong a political approach yung SOVI, placing the blame on numbers of vulnerable people and not really on other aspects which make the people vulnerable or more susceptible to the impacts of the hazard. And finally, how do we now capture the issues that are independent to the natural hazards in the vulnerability assessment?
Yeah. Thanks, Sir Jake. Hi. So good question about the political aspects of using, there's a politics behind the use of indices like this. Okay. And then on one hand, as you mentioned, it puts the blame on the vulnerable groups, but at the same time, for some researchers, they see it as, highlighting the vulnerability of a certain group or a population or individuals using different indicators. For example, you mentioned about, I'm not sure, was it gender or age or different social economic or social demographic indicators, like children, persons with disability, informal settlers, population density. All of these 35 indicators, both sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure to natural hazards, we all consider them into the Cotter model, social vulnerability index model. But we try to tweak them based on the available data that we have. On your second question related to, sorry, Ms. Cathy, can you repeat the second question connected to that?
The usefulness of the DRRM planning, if we have
Yeah.
these types of assessment already in place.
Yes. Well, at least for the SOVI, so what we did as part of the process, So we did the study, and then we converted this into a more palatable policy brief. We call it the science policy brief, like a 1 to 2 page brief that we can, distribute and share with city officials. So that's what we did, and then we presented it to them and asked if these, observations based from the study correlate with what they experienced prior to Yolanda. Apparently, at the barangay level, as I mentioned a while ago, barangay 88, and we didn't do any statistical correlation and relationship, but it seems that may relationship, at least visually, in terms of, high, low, medium, in terms of deaths, number of deaths per barangay and and also the vulnerability index per barangay. So if we had this vulnerability assessment, whatever the tool is, could be SOVI, it could be something else, it could be useful. I'm not saying that it will be perfectly useful, but it could inform decision-making processes. But then I would like to emphasize also that it can also be political. It depends on the city officials if they would be using this, all right? Because they could target, they could target vulnerable populations for their own interests, political interests. No? So that can also be used for political, agenda. So you're right in saying that, even the use of these assessments can be highly political.
Yeah, and then the last part in the question is, how do we capture the issues that are independent of natural hazards in the vulnerability assessment?
Yeah. So for the indices, we have that as separate. Unfortunately, I can show to you how we computed it. It's kind of there are computations that we use for sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure, but there are independent indicators that we use for sensitivity and adaptive capacity. For example, for sensitivity, we used around 12 sub-indicators. It includes proportion of unemployed persons in the labor force, population density, and a couple of things related to that. And then we have a separate computation for climate-induced hazards. So those are landslide susceptibility, flood susceptibility, and we map them out through GIS in terms of extent. And then we overlay them with the sensitivity and adaptive capacity indices. And that's where, we relate everything else so that we can define more thoroughly what the vulnerability index is. I hope I answered that. Right.
that was a lot of information. Thank you, Iggy. You actually made a shout out to her earlier, and this time Ma'am Darlene is raising her hand. Ma'am Darl, do you have a comment or a question for our speaker?
Yes, thank you, Kathy, and Luigi, congratulations, and thank you for that excellent presentation. No, the department is very proud of you. No, I have a comment, and just siguro this question has already been asked. No, the chronic problem kasi sa tingin ko that seems to loom forever is the capacity of the vulnerable population to cope from your presentation, to cope, adapt, and improve. It is so easy to say that they should do this in the face of the natural hazards that they are exposed to, without support from the government. So I think capacity building is important before we can build or help vulnerable population build resilience. So if this framework could be applied to the LGUs, pero syempre there should be support. I think this is a very good way of measuring vulnerability, and from that, doon mo i-build ang resilience ng mga communities that are exposed to the natural hazards. Okay, thank you.
That's right, Ma'am Darl. If I may also add, yeah, it's really important you mentioned about capacity building and development, and it's one of the main, you know, challenges, and also can be considered as an opportunity for LGUs to, step up on. Um, we have what we call the DRRM plans, and we have 70% of the DRRM fund dedicated to see to such kind of activities, pre-disaster activities like capacity development. Unfortunately, based on COA, Commission on Audit, in one of their you know annual studies, they found that local government units, even DRRM officers, do not have the right technical capacity to use the DRRM funds. So that's one. So what more if they don't have capacity to, provide the capacity development for their own, vulnerable communities. So that's where the academe, NGOs, people's organizations, and even development organizations come in. And this is why partnership is very important. You have academe that can provide these kinds of indices, and then you have, let's say, PGS, as a society, as an NGO, who can, work with LGUs to make sure that the cities, have the right capacity, have the right, resilience mechanisms to build, and adapt to the changing climate.
Yeah, so I like this concept that you mentioned, Luigi, about the partnership. The things that's happening, global climate change, it's a global event actually. So it's really, everyone has a part to play in it and in addressing it as well. We all have a role to play in it. And just to wrap up everything, I would like to read the comment of Lorna Inamak in the chat box
Yep,
that
that's my
goes with
sister.
that. Yeah. Ah, okay. So it's tackling climate change is equally a global responsibility. And this goes right in with the partnership that you were talking about, right? Every This is our planet, the Earth. It's our home, and we all have a stake for this. In this, so it's really the responsibility of every global citizen, right?
That's right. It's a shared responsibility, both for climate change mitigation. So mitigation is, reducing emissions, and at the same time adaptation and disaster risk reduction. It's global. It's a global issue, but we need to make sure that we hold accountable who's supposed to be held accountable, like the developed countries that have emitted a huge percentage of emissions globally. That's why we have adaptation right now. Vulnerable countries are trying to step up to adapt to the changing climate. And given the lack of financing from the global community, this is something that we need to push for. So we have advocacy. Advocacy is also very important. Aside from partnership, you have different organizations fighting for climate justice, climate for fighting for funding, equally, determined, financing for everyone, for all countries, vulnerable countries. So we have to make sure that these mechanisms are in place.
All right. Thank you very much, Luigi. That was really a very good presentation. Lots of information, things to really think about. in this presentation that you gave us. So, to show our appreciation, of course, the Philippine Geographical Society would like to give a certificate of appreciation to our presenter. So, this certificate of appreciation is given to Luigi Toda for the valuable insights and expertise shared as virtual resource speaker for the talk Measuring Vulnerability and Resilience as part of the Philippine Geographical Society Lecture Series 2022, held on March 28, 2022. Ayan. So once again, thank you very much, Luigi, for sharing your research and, of course, your insights and experience.
Thank you to everyone for and PGS and Department of Geography for the invitation.
All right. And then for this last part of the presentation, I would like to call Professor Joseph Palis, Chair of the UP Diliman Department of Geography, for a brief synthesis of the lecture and to give his closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and wonderful to hear the presentation of Luigi. As I mentioned in one of my conversation with colleagues, I said I thought I understood it much better now, especially how you were able to distill much of the discussions of vulnerability and resilience. So kudos for that. I do want to say something about this presentation that make a few points, more like reiteration of what Luigi has mentioned, that natural hazards is not always just equivalent to disaster. There's a much bigger cultural, political, definitely global force that's at play here. Vulnerability itself is not seen as, it's always seen as objective rather than having a kind of linear reality. So, and I particularly appreciate how he tied up the vulnerability to a much larger economic force that has upstaged and sometimes upended most of the community and local efforts and collectives. I want to emphasize also the use of the maps as a communicative tool in order to illuminate some of the truths that are in there. But I also say that it had to be constantly contextualized so that people will understand what's at stake in most of what is shown in the maps. We just can show maps for the sake of showing all these kinds of information without a much more responsible and ethical mindset that come with it. And also one thing that struck with me was also this penchant of many of our maybe people like ourselves, definitely the government, of glorifying resilience and making it appear like without any government assistance, we can soldier on with our lives. And I like the fact that Luigi kind of recast it and say something like, maybe when we look at resilience, we talk about effective governance. And that doesn't just involve the government, but also collectives such as individuals, local communities, people's organizations, and the much larger society to be participatory or to participate in decision making that pertain a supranational scale phenomenon such as climate change. And I really commend this presentation so much because of how it was able to show that's not just in the Philippines, but also happening in Vietnam, in Bangladesh as case studies, because they show us that what happened in some areas may be specific in particular, but they also can be generalized and can have similar outcomes in different countries in the world. So thank you very much, Luigi, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. And like what Mom Darlene said, we're happy to have you talk about your experience and making a full circle kind of presentation. At this point, I do want to invite you to the next PGS Lecture Series. It's happening in June 24. The Philippine Geographical Society prides itself with coming up with a monthly PGS Lecture Series that are geared towards much more relatable applied geography undertakings.
and how it relates to the Philippines. And so far, we have had some wonderful and insightful and definitely truly collaborative um, presentations. One is also coming from our alumnus, James Russell Andrade, who now works at the local governments for sustainability in Southeast Asia. So we'll have the publicity material for that one as the date nears. We're also going to have something for July and August. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Palis, and to everyone in the session. Thank you for your participation in this PGSLS. The PGS has an open call for membership. You may visit the website for more details. And to watch previous sessions of the PGS Lecture Series, please go to the YouTube channel of the UP Diliman Department of Geography. The recorded lecture for this session will also be posted in the same channel. Before we end the meeting, we'll play one last drums for you.